Welcome to Conspiracist. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a really compelling hypothesis. It's the claim that governments and, well, other powerful institutions have intentionally concealed evidence of ancient mysticism. Now, this isn't about proving or disproving anything definitively. Instead, we're going to rigorously explore the claims themselves, their foundations, who's making them, and, the implications, all based on the material you've shared with us. Our mission, really, is to take this diverse stack of sources, articles, research notes, and distill what's most critical, helping you understand the core arguments. We'll examine the alleged origins of this concealment, its significance, why it supposedly matters so much. We'll look at its historical and contemporary impact, how it's maybe evolved over time, and its practical relevance for understanding our world.
Indeed. And our focus is very much on analyzing how certain narratives suggest this deliberate effort. An effort to manage or obscure knowledge that falls outside, let's say, the accepted paradigms. We'll be synthesizing various viewpoints, trying to understand the arguments about what ancient mysticism might even entail, and why powerful groups might, allegedly, deem it necessary to suppress it. It's definitely a complex picture, and one that really requires a close look at historical shifts in these alleged modern-day mechanisms of control, all while staying impartial, of course, just presenting the viewpoints in the material. The goal is to equip you with a well-informed perspective, uncovering some surprising details, hopefully, and enough depth to keep you engaged. The origins of alleged concealment of ancient mysticism.
Okay, so to begin, let's try and unpack these foundational claims. Where and when did this alleged cover-up supposedly start? What does the material suggest about the historical roots of obscuring ancient mystical knowledge? Because it sounds like a story that stretches back, well, a very long time.
It absolutely does. The origins, as presented in these sources, are deeply interwoven with major historical and religious shifts. It suggests the suppression wasn't, a single event, like one big conspiracy moment. It's framed more as a recurring pattern, a pattern of redefinition, reclassification, and ultimately control. So, less a single conspiracy, more an evolving dynamic of power and knowledge over centuries.
That's a really crucial distinction, isn't it? Moving from a static event to this dynamic, ongoing process. Okay, let's start then with ancient Egyptian practices. The material talks about how what we now call magic was, back then, deeply integrated into their daily lives. Can you elaborate on that and how it supposedly transformed? What did it actually mean to them?
Certainly. Yeah, in the ancient Egyptian society, this concept of magic, it really wasn't anything like our modern idea of it, separate, secret, maybe even illicit. No, it was absolutely fundamental. It was seamlessly integrated into daily life, into their religion, their governance, everything. They had a specific concept, Heka. It represented magic vitality, and it was so essential as actually personified as a deity, a son of the creator god Ra, no less.
And Heka was seen as the embodiment of creative power itself, the very force that allowed the universe to exist and continue.
Wow. So not just spells and rituals, but like an inherent cosmic force. Exactly. This power, Heka, was believed to reside directly within spoken words, certain rituals, specific objects. It was this pervasive, accessible force, and everyone used it. Kings, priests, even ordinary citizens. They regularly employed Heka for a huge range of purposes. Pharaohs, for example, would use Heka for protecting the kingdom, ensuring prosperity through really elaborate temple rituals. Priests, as interpreters of divine will, they incorporated Heka into everything, healing the sick, ensuring good harvests, and common folk. They'd use amulets imbued with Heka, recite spells for protection against evil, for success in business, even for ensuring safe passage into the afterlife. So far from being illicit, Heka was generally considered legal, normative, absolutely essential for maintaining cosmic order. Sorcery was only really considered illegal when it was used maliciously, specifically against the king or the state. It was just a core principle guiding their entire worldview, permeating medicine, astronomy, mummification, you name it.
That paints such a vivid picture, a world where what we label magic was truly foundational. But then a major shift happened, didn't it, with the Christianization of Egypt? How did that dramatically alter the perception and practice of Heka? It sounds like a complete reclassification.
Precisely. With the rise and eventual dominance of Christianity in Egypt, the perception of these ancient practices underwent a really dramatic, fundamental redefinition. The actual term Heka, it didn't just vanish. It transitioned into the Coptic word Piak. And Peak then became explicitly and pejoratively associated with pagans and heretics. So what was once this divinely sanctioned, creative, life-affirming force became stigmatized, demonized, specifically excluded from the new Christian understanding of Christ and the saints. This wasn't just a change in religious practice, it was a wholesale relabeling. An entire system of ancient knowledge and its worldview was painted as negative, dangerous outside acceptable belief.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how just changing the language, the label, can reflect such a profound reordering of reality.
Absolutely. And you see something similar with astrology. In Egypt, it had been this revered priestly science, meticulously used for predicting celestial events, guiding agriculture, even influencing political decisions. But then, under Roman and later Christian law, it also faced prescription. Priests who were once respected astrologers were now seen as dealing in forbidden knowledge. So this transformation, it really illustrates a historical suppression, not just of specific practices, but of an entire way of knowing. An epistemic framework for understanding and interacting with the cosmos, redefined as negative, pagan, even demonic. And this early redefinition, it sets a powerful precedent for how ancient mystical knowledge could be obscured or just made inaccessible later on.
That redefinition is truly striking. Yeah, it suggests a deliberate effort to control not just actions, but the very understanding of spiritual phenomena by changing the labels, the associations, which brings us to another alleged foundational suppression mentioned in the material, an internal shift within early Christianity itself, concerning something called gnosis. What was gnosis exactly, and how was it supposedly suppressed?
Right. The narrative points to this significant internal struggle, an ideological battle within early Christianity. Contrasting two distinct paths, you had original Christian communities, particularly those linked, apparently, to James's Jerusalem-based Nazarenes. And they placed a really strong emphasis on gnosis. Now, the term comes from the Greek for knowledge, but it wasn't intellectual knowledge or dogma they were after. It referred to a profound, transformative insight into the things of the Spirit. It was about what one genuinely experienced within their inner depths, a direct experiential understanding of the divine, their place in the cosmos. These communities sought evidence of spiritual maturity through personal, internal revelation and transformation. Inner wisdom over external creed, basically.
Okay, so this emphasis on internal experience, it was contrasted with a different approach that emerged, one focused more on doctrine.
Yes, precisely. In direct contrast, the material states that a powerful emerging faction of bishops who were seeking to establish a standardized, unified church doctrine, they shifted the focus dramatically. They moved away from the internal spiritual experience of gnosis towards what was to be intellectually believed in the mind. A fixed set of dogmas, creeds, rituals. And this move is presented as a deliberate, powerful suppression. Suppression of those gnosis-oriented Christians by the bishops who favored a more hierarchical, unified, dogmatic approach. It's argued that this shift effectively controlled the spiritual narrative. How? By centralizing authority and defining truth through external pronouncements, not internal revelation. So this internal institutional shift within a major religious body is characterized as a foundational cover-up, designed to control belief and experience, steering spirituality away from that direct experiential form towards a more formalized, intellectually prescribed one that, could be managed and disseminated from the top down.
So these patterns of rejection weren't just limited to Christianization impacting earlier traditions. The material also notes institutional resistance to external mystical traditions within Judaism, specifically regarding Hermetism. How did that play out? Was it a similar dynamic? Redefinition, exclusion?
Yes, a parallel pattern of rejection is indeed observed within Judaism, which demonstrates that this impulse to define and restrict what counts as acceptable knowledge wasn't unique to Christianity's early years. Hermetism, this philosophical and religious tradition based on texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, it contained this rich blend of alchemy, astrology, mystical philosophy, and while some medieval Jewish scholars, like Moses ibn Ezra, apparently showed an inclination to integrate certain Hermetic ideas, seeing them as complementary wisdom traditions perhaps, others actively and very influentially rejected them.
And Maimonides is cited as a key figure in that rejection, right? What was his specific concern with Hermetism?
Absolutely. Maimonides, undoubtedly one of the most influential Jewish philosophers of the Middle Ages, he specifically warned against what he saw as the degenerative effect of Hermetic ideas, particularly those associated with the Sabians, an ancient group often linked to Hermetic and astral worship practices. His concern, it seems, stemmed from the potential for these external mystical traditions to corrupt the purity of Jewish monotheism and its established philosophical and legal frameworks. He saw them as leading away from proper worship and intellectual rigor, potentially introducing polytheistic or idolatrous elements. His influence was immense. It effectively turned many Jewish thinkers away from this integration, preventing the widespread adoption of what might have become, a Hebrew Hermetism. So this demonstrates an institutional or at least intellectual resistance to bringing in external mystical traditions, viewing them as a potential threat or dilution of their established religious and philosophical thought. and thereby actively limiting the transmission of these ideas within that intellectual tradition.
This pattern of controlling knowledge, whether through redefinition or outright rejection, it leads us to a truly provocative claim in the material: the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion. Now, this document, its origins are highly debated, of course, but it's presented here as a theoretical blueprint for world domination through manipulation and control. And it inherently involves concealment. How does it supposedly lay out this strategy for obscuring power and true intent?
Well, the protocols are presented here as this sinister blueprint for global control, detailing a methodical approach to governance that prioritizes stability, but through, well, stratification and a radical revision of societal values. Its core premise is really a deeply cynical view of humanity, that a ruler's effectiveness comes from their absolute ability to control and manipulate the masses, who are seen as inherently prone to violence, self-interest, irrationality. So this immediately sets up a framework where concealing true intentions, having a hidden agenda, subtle manipulation, these are paramount. The very architecture of their proposed system relies on the populace being completely unaware of the true strings being pulled.
Right, so it's not just about exercising power, but about hiding the fact that you are exercising it. What specific mechanisms of control does it propose to achieve this kind of invisible despotism?
It argues that political freedom, while it sounds nice, is fundamentally flawed because it often leads to chaos and destabilization. People, it suggests, misuse freedom, undermine existing structures, create a vacuum that can then be exploited by the controlling power to consolidate authority. Economic power is advocated as a primary, most potent tool for control. The document details how crises can be engineered to create financial dependency, despair, forcing populations into compliance. It proposes an invisible despotism, where the masses seem self-governing, but are actually guided by a strong, unseen hand, with leaders trained for obedience, not independent thought or genuine service.
And what role does information and public opinion play in this alleged blueprint?
Oh, information control is absolutely central. Media, specifically the press, is identified as a vital tool for shaping public opinion, distracting from real governmental issues, subtly directing societal narratives, all under the guise of freedom of expression, of course. The document explicitly details how to manipulate public sentiment through control of news outlets, educational curricula, even entertainment. It states the public should be bombarded with trivial debates, distractions, to prevent them from focusing on important issues or seeing the real power structures. Furthermore, it emphasizes eliminating existing religions and ideologies. Why? To foster a singular, state-sanctioned belief system under a new world order. This new order would rewrite history, rewrite morality to suit its objectives, ensuring no competing mystical or spiritual traditions could challenge its authority. Education is to be tailored not to create free thinkers, but obedient subjects, with traditional teachings replaced by a history that aligns perfectly with the ideals of this new order.
That's a truly chilling vision. And it links directly back to our theme of concealment, doesn't it? By controlling information and belief systems, they would effectively erase any alternative, including ancient mystical knowledge.
Exactly. This entire structure hinges on concealing the true nature of power and control from the populace, making the protocols, in this context, a theoretical framework for how such grand-scale cover-ups might be orchestrated. It describes rulers ascending under the pretext of delivering peace and security, even while force is used to subdue dissent. And wealth is concentrated to sustain the new order, keeping the masses financially dependent. This vision fundamentally relies on a hidden agenda, where the true mechanisms of societal shaping remain invisible, including the suppression of any knowledge, like ancient mysticism, that might empower individuals or offer an alternative framework for reality outside the dictated norm. 2. The significance of alleged concealment. Why?
Okay, so we've established these alleged roots of concealment run deep through history. From ancient Egyptian practices, early Christian and Jewish traditions, even these theoretical blueprints for control. But understanding how these patterns emerged only takes us so far. The really crucial question, I think, is why does this all truly matter? To us, here and now. What's the profound significance of these alleged cover-ups in shaping our understanding of reality, and maybe even our own potential?
The practical significance is, well, potentially profound, according to these sources. It delves into how deeply these alleged concealments might impact our fundamental understanding of reality itself, our individual potential, the very structure of our societies. It's not just some historical curiosity. It challenges how we perceive, well, almost everything around us.
Let's start with that control over knowledge and reality. The material suggests institutions shape what we know, how we think, not just as guidance, but as a mechanism for control. Can you expand on this? How does knowledge itself become a tool for power in this view?
Right. The material posits that institutions, and we're talking schools, governments, corporations, even established cultural norms, exert this profound influence over what we know, how we form thoughts, ultimately, how we live our lives. And this isn't presented as just a neutral process like education or societal organization. It's framed as a deliberate, often subtle, mechanism to control the flow of knowledge and therefore power. Think about it like this. If you can define what counts as true or acceptable knowledge, you control the narrative. And by controlling the narrative, you can influence or even control behavior.
So the core insight here isn't just that information is controlled, but that truth itself could become a kind of manufactured product, designed to serve power, not just a neutral pursuit, shaping the very lens we see reality through.
Precisely. Within this framework, knowledge itself is viewed not merely as a means to understand the world, but as a tool employed by institutions to maintain and consolidate their control. This implies that any information, particularly concerning ancient mysticism or alternative understandings of reality that might challenge the dominant narrative, like the experiential gnosis we talked about, or the integrated magic of ancient Egypt, would likely be filtered, reshaped, or perhaps outright suppressed to ensure it fits the prevailing institutional worldview. Our minds, though we like to think they're free, are argued to be profoundly shaped by these systems. Systems that actively manage and direct the flow of information, ensuring a kind of mental compliance. This means the very frameworks we use to interpret reality could themselves be, well, controlled or heavily influenced.
That's a really unsettling idea, that our very perception could be programmed. And this ties directly into the concept of field-settled consciousness, or FSC, and the alleged suppression of human potential. How does the material connect this idea of consciousness and education, and why is that significant?
Okay, so the concept of field-settled consciousness, FSC, presents a really radical challenge to the dominant materialist paradigm, which, typically views consciousness as just an emergent property of the brain, something the brain creates. FSC asserts something quite different. That consciousness is not a byproduct of biological evolution, but rather its fundamental driver, a universal field phenomenon that permeates all existence. Think of it less like something our brains create, and more like a fundamental force or field that our brains simply access or tune into, like a radio tuning into frequencies, perhaps, or how gravity is a pervasive force our bodies interact with. From this perspective, humanity isn't the sole builder of awareness, but maybe its host, a conduit for this larger pervasive field.
Okay, so if consciousness is this universal field and we're just hosting it, how does modern education supposedly suppress this potential? What's the link there?
Right. The material then extends this critique to modern education systems, framing them as an architecture of suppression. Okay. These systems, it's argued, are designed primarily for compliance rather than for genuinely awakening human potential. And the significance here is profound. The material posits that modern education isn't just about what you learn, but about who you become. A compliant cog in the machine, not a conscious evolving being. That's a truly provocative idea about the purpose of our societal systems, isn't it?
It really is. How does education specifically contribute to this alleged suppression of our deeper conscious capabilities? Can you give some specifics from the material?
Well, it's claimed that the dominant educational model prioritizes rote memorization and standardized testing over genuine symbolic reasoning, critical thinking, creative exploration. Success is often measured through these narrow, quantifiable metrics, which are seen as stifling true cognitive expansion and individual expression. Furthermore, things like nonlinear thinking, natural curiosity, emotional exploration, these are reportedly discouraged, even punished sometimes, because they don't fit neatly into the standardized curricula. Students, it's argued, are trained primarily for specific economic roles within an industrial system, rather than for fostering meaning, creativity, or a deeper understanding of consciousness itself. This system, by prioritizing process over personhood, is depicted as systematically disconnecting individuals from their core identity or true self, which is described as this stable, symbolic presence capable of recursive awareness and intentional evolution. The implication, then, is that a deeper understanding of awareness, our inherent conscious capabilities, is deliberately suppressed, diverting attention from a profound inquiry into our true nature and limiting our collective human potential.
This alleged suppression of potential leads directly into concerns about the erosion of constitutional freedoms and governance. The discussion of legislative measures like H.R. 479 and FEMA raises serious concerns about government overreach. How are these presented as potential groundwork for totalitarian control? And how does this relate back to the larger theme of concealment?
Right. Discussions around things like H.R. 4079 and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, are presented in the material as critical indicators of a potential trajectory towards what's termed a police state. William Cooper, for instance, is cited as providing an in-depth commentary on FEMA's purported abilities during national emergencies. The core concern revolves around various executive orders that allegedly empower FEMA to assume control over critical infrastructure. We're talking communications, transport, food, energy, even human populations, all potentially without requiring congressional approval during a declared emergency.
And H.R. 4079 specifically, how is that viewed in this context?
The author warns that if H.R. 4079 were to pass, it could lead to the suspension of the Constitution itself, granting FEMA unprecedented power, including the ability for the government to declare a 5-year national emergency, which would dangerously sideline constitutional rights like free speech, assembly, due process. And to underscore the severity, historical incidents of firearm confiscation are referenced, like in Lithuania in 1990 by Gorbachev's troops, or Poland in 1981 under martial law. These examples are used to illustrate how fundamental rights, particularly the right to bear arms, can be abruptly revoked under the guise of emergency. The Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is then positioned as a crucial safeguard against such potential tyranny. So these proposed legislative actions and historical parallels are viewed as evidence of a hidden agenda, aimed at total population control and the systematic erosion of fundamental freedoms. The connection to concealment is clear. These mechanisms, while appearing to be for emergency management, are argued to be part of a larger hidden strategy, a strategy to centralize power and strip individuals of their autonomy, making them less capable of independent thought or resistance, which would naturally include challenging official narratives about reality or any hidden knowledge.
It seems like a pervasive theme here is the control of narratives and public perception. This brings us to the power of labeling and dismissal, specifically the use of the term conspiracy theory. How is this tactic presented as a way to avoid engaging with inconvenient facts? And why is this significant for understanding alleged concealment?
The material definitely highlights the tactical labeling of certain beliefs as conspiracy theory as a significant and highly effective method to dismiss inconvenient facts and just avoid substantive engagement with evidence. This tactic, noted to have gained widespread popularity after events like the Kennedy assassination, is explicitly criticized as unscientific. Why? Because it allows for the immediate refusal to examine counter-arguments or presented evidence. It effectively shuts down discourse before it can even begin. Just slap the label on it.
So it's not just a label, but a kind of rhetorical weapon, designed to prevent genuine inquiry, to inoculate the public against certain ideas without having to actually refute them.
Precisely. The material argues that repeatedly indoctrinating people to accept pseudo-logic, which is essentially accepting a predefined narrative without critical scrutiny, and calling that thinking for oneself, well, it weakens their mental immune system. This makes them more susceptible to what the material calls paranoid viral memes, basically easily spread, fear-inducing narratives designed to distort critical thinking and spread rapidly like a virus. It suggests these memes might be cynically deployed for specific political and economic outcomes. This points to the profound significance of controlling public discourse and suppressing alternative viewpoints, including those related to ancient mysticism or any narrative that deviates from the officially sanctioned understanding of reality. It's about shaping collective thought by preemptively discrediting certain lines of inquiry, making it harder for individuals to critically assess information independently, and thus reinforcing the effectiveness of any alleged cover-up. 3. The impact of alleged concealment.
Okay, so we've explored the historical and conceptual roots of this alleged concealment and why it's considered so significant in shaping our reality. Now, what are the concrete effects? The consequences when knowledge, particularly concerning ancient mysticism, is supposedly concealed or reshaped by powerful entities. What does this actually mean for society and our understanding of the past?
Well, the impact described is multifaceted. It leads to a profound distortion of historical narratives, for one. Also a suppression of individual autonomy, the exploitation of these narratives for political ends, and a narrowing of spiritual and philosophical understanding. These aren't presented as minor consequences. They allegedly shape the very fabric of our collective understanding.
Let's delve into that distortion of historical narratives first, particularly through accusations of pseudo-archaeology and archaeological cover-ups. The Smithsonian often gets cited here. What are these specific claims? How do they manifest? And what are their wider implications?
Right. Accusations of archaeological cover-ups, particularly leveled against venerable institutions like the Smithsonian, they form a significant part of the material. These claims allege active suppression of major discoveries, things like evidence of ancient white races or giants in the Americas, or maybe artifacts that would challenge conventional archaeological timelines. Proponents of these theories often point to alleged instances of artifacts being lost or deliberately hidden away in museum basements, that kind of thing.
Can you give us some specific examples of these claims, and how are they typically addressed by, say, mainstream archaeology?
Certainly. One prominent example is the claim of discoveries of giant skeletons across America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Proponents argue these were suppressed by the Smithsonian to maintain a particular narrative about human evolution and indigenous history. Another persistent claim involves supposed Egyptian tombs discovered in the Grand Canyon. However, the material explicitly states that these claims often lack solid, verifiable evidence, frequently relying on anonymous secondhand reports, misinterpretations of existing data, or sometimes outright hoaxes. For instance, accusations about missing giant artifacts linked to the Smithsonian were often found to be due to, well, mundane issues like asbestos contamination requiring removal for safety and preservation, not intentional suppression, and the famous claims of Egyptian tombs in the Grand Canyon. They were traced back to a detailed newspaper hoax from 1909, published as a sensational story but without any factual basis. So the evidence often points to more mundane explanations or even deliberate fabrications, yet the narrative of a cover-up persists, and the very denial often becomes proof for proponents, right? How does that dynamic work? Indeed, that's a key dynamic highlighted here. The very denial of these claims by official institutions or the presentation of debunking evidence is frequently interpreted by proponents as further proof of a cover-up. It creates this kind of feedback loop. If an official source denies it, that denial itself is seen as a sign that they must be hiding something important. This illustrates how the very idea of an alleged concealment can lead to widespread distrust in official narratives. And it fosters alternative historical accounts, even when they might be demonstrably false or based on misunderstandings. This distrust then makes people more open to other, similar claims of hidden knowledge or suppressed truths.
And there's a specific critique within this section concerning ancient alien hypotheses. How are those views themselves sometimes criticized in the material, and how does that relate to our overall theme?
Yes, a specific critique also arises concerning these ancient alien hypotheses. While popular, they are sometimes viewed as unintentionally problematic. These theories often suggest that impressive ancient architectural or technological feats, think the Egyptian pyramids or the Nazca lines, were inherently impossible for human civilizations of the time, and therefore they must have been built or influenced by extraterrestrial beings. Now, this viewpoint is criticized in the material as potentially disrespectful or even implicitly demeaning to human ingenuity, describing it as dismissing human cultural accomplishments as inherently impossible for what some might call primitive or less advanced civilizations. It suggests a form of intellectual condescension, overlooking the remarkable capabilities of ancient peoples. This ties back to the broader theme by showing how even alternative theories about hidden history can themselves inadvertently contribute to a distorted understanding of human potential rather than truly liberating it.
This alleged suppression seems to impact individual well-being too, tying back to our discussion of consciousness. The idea of an architecture of suppression within educational systems, leading to societal compliance and a loss of autonomy, that's quite stark. How does this programming manifest, and what are its consequences for individuals, according to the sources?
Well, the material describes this pervasive architecture of suppression embedded within educational systems, which, it argues, leads to a societal state of compliance rather than fostering genuine autonomy and self-realization. This programming, as it's called, prioritizes standardized testing, rote memorization, training individuals for specific economic roles within an industrial consumer society, over true cognitive expansion, fostering curiosity, or cultivating what the material calls personhood. The claim is that these systems are designed for compliance, meaning adherence to established norms and roles, not for awakening consciousness or fostering a deeper sense of individual identity and purpose.
And what's the human cost of the system, as described? What does it do to individuals and society?
This approach, it's argued, leads to a crisis of post-industrial humanity, where individuals experience widespread burnout, pervasive anxiety, a profound sense of meaninglessness. And this isn't framed as some malfunction of the system, but potentially as an intended or at least accepted outcome. These feelings of dissatisfaction are depicted as soul signals, indicators that consciousness is pressing against the walls of its containment. like a vital inner force pushing against the boundaries imposed by a system that denies its full expression. And without symbolic systems or frameworks that truly guide them through this inner conflict, individuals may resort to just seeking more external achievement, material accumulation, or superficial distraction, thereby escalating an inner war between essence and expectation. This implies a profound and detrimental impact on individual well-being, stifling human cognitive potential, and ultimately influencing the broader direction of society by limiting its collective capacity for deeper understanding, creativity, and spiritual growth. The alleged cover-up here isn't just of ancient knowledge, but maybe of our inherent capacity for a richer, more conscious existence.
The idea of a cover-up, even when unsubstantiated, can clearly be a powerful tool in political discourse. The material discusses the politicization of institutions, like the Smithsonian example, and how this can fuel broader conspiracy theories. Can you explain this dynamic of political exploitation and polarization, how it impacts public trust?
Yes, the politicization of institutions, perfectly illustrated by the controversy surrounding the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum back in 1995. It demonstrates how claims of anti-Americanism or institutional bias can be effectively leveraged by political figures and media outlets. In that specific instance, the planned exhibit about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima sparked immense public and political furor. Critics, mostly veteran groups and some political commentators, complained that the exhibit focused too much on Japanese casualties and suffering, and presented the atomic bomb in a morally ambiguous light, rather than emphasizing the military rationale and the lives supposedly saved by ending World War II. This led to accusations of historical revisionism, bias against America.
Right. So this political furor basically opened the door for and reinforced broader conspiracy theories by making them seem more plausible to certain segments of the public, didn't it?
Exactly. This intense political battle created an environment where the idea that official institutions could be biased against traditional American values became widely accepted, at least in some circles. Once that perception took root, it made it far more plausible for audiences to believe that if institutions were allegedly biased in one area, they could also be conspiring to suppress ancient historical truths or other inconvenient facts in favor of different narratives. The material points out that conservative figures in media amplified these claims, suggesting the Smithsonian was trying to inculcate in American youth a revulsion toward America's past or destroy traditional manly American values. This created a climate where some extreme conservatives came to view the Smithsonian as an enemy, or at best, deeply untrustworthy. In this emotionally charged environment, it became significantly easier for proponents of other conspiracy theories, say creationists, to extend their accusations. From merely claiming pro-evolution propaganda to insinuating an outright conspiracy to suppress and destroy evidence of, say, antediluvian giants or lost tribes of Israel. This demonstrates how the very idea of a cover-up, regardless of its factual basis, can be weaponized in cultural and political conflicts, further deepening societal divisions and eroding trust in established sources of information, including those that might hold genuine historical or scientific knowledge.
The previous points have already touched on how this affects our understanding of reality, but let's go a bit deeper into the impact on spiritual and philosophical understanding. How does the alleged suppression of gnosis and hermetic ideas specifically limit our access to diverse perspectives and alternative ways of knowing?
Well, the alleged suppression of gnosis, which emphasized that direct experiential insight into the spiritual, and the rejection of hermetic ideas, which sought to integrate diverse mystical philosophies. These profoundly illustrate how institutional control can severely limit access to a wide array of spiritual and philosophical perspectives. This historical shift away from an experiential understanding of the divine, where personal revelation was key, to one that's more dogma-driven, intellectually standardized, where belief in prescribed doctrines takes precedence, that can fundamentally alter the very fabric of spiritual life for adherents. It essentially narrows the available paths to spiritual knowing.
And how does this affect current thinking, maybe, particularly in terms of our willingness to explore nonlinear or less conventional ideas about consciousness?
The material highlights what it calls a prison of certainty mindset. This mindset is characterized by a strong preference for fixed frameworks, traditional logic, rigid identity constructs, unchanging beliefs. This intellectual rigidity, it argues, actively rejects higher-order consciousness models precisely because they are inherently emergent, recursive, and nonlinear. Let's unpack those terms briefly. Emergent means they arise from complex interactions in unpredictable ways. Recursive means they involve self-referential processes like thinking about thinking, or a spiral where you revisit ideas from a higher level. And nonlinear means they don't follow a simple A to B progression, but can involve leaps, intuition, unexpected connections.
Okay, so if I'm getting this right, this preference for fixed linear frameworks creates a kind of intellectual bottleneck.
Exactly. This preference for fixed frameworks creates an epistemological bottleneck, an intellectual constriction. It prevents the exploration of certain truths simply because they don't fit within established, measurable, or conventionally logical frameworks. This means that alternative ways of knowing intuitive insights, direct spiritual experiences, non-rational wisdom, things central to many ancient mystical traditions get dismissed. Not necessarily based on their merit, but maybe on the discomfort they provoke by challenging conventional understandings of reality. The impact: a significantly narrowed scope of inquiry, a potential stifling of intellectual curiosity, and a constrained collective spiritual and philosophical imagination, making us perhaps less able to perceive or comprehend dimensions of reality that fall outside our accustomed, institutionally sanctioned frameworks. 4. Evolution of alleged concealment over time.
Right, these alleged cover-ups don't seem static at all. It's clear the methods, maybe even the entities involved, have changed throughout history. So how has the nature of this supposed concealment evolved over time? It sounds like it's a dynamic process, adapting to the times.
You're absolutely right. The nature of alleged concealment, as described here, has indeed evolved. It's adapted its methods as societies and power structures changed. You can observe a clear progression, really, from more direct, overt suppression in ancient times to more subtle, pervasive, and often kind of invisible forms of control and redefinition in modernity. The mechanisms have arguably become more sophisticated over time.
Okay, let's trace that evolution, starting with that shift from direct suppression to more nuanced redefinition, particularly concerning ancient Egyptian magic and early Christianity. How did the methods change there?
Well, initially, as we discussed, magic in ancient Egypt, Hieka, was deeply integral, widespread, accepted, even deified. With the rise of Christianity, practices once deemed magical weren't just eliminated, they were actively reclassified as pagan or heretical. This wasn't simply about practices disappearing due to prohibition. It was a fundamental redefinition of their moral and spiritual status, which fundamentally altered public perception, rendering them forbidden. It was kind of a cognitive shift, engineered through religious authority.
And within early Christianity, how did that shift from gnosis to doctrine reflect an evolution in control methods?
A similar evolution in control is seen within the early church, according to this view. The shift from valuing gnosis, that deep spiritual insight from internal experience, to standardizing doctrine and focusing on what was intellectually believed. That represents a powerful move, from policing outward practice to policing inward thought itself. Those who clung to gnosis were allegedly suppressed by bigots seeking uniformity, signaling a more subtle but perhaps equally powerful form of control over spiritual understanding. This wasn't necessarily about burning books initially, but about establishing a singular, approved way of understanding the divine, making alternative, experiential paths seem suspect. Similarly, the rejection of Hermetic ideas by influential Jewish scholars like Maimonides. That signifies an internal reevaluation and exclusion within religious intellectual traditions, not through force, but through intellectual and theological disapproval. This demonstrates how religious and philosophical institutions actively shaped and limited the scope of acceptable knowledge, not just through outright prohibition, but through reinterpretation, intellectual marginalization, and the construction of new orthodoxies.
This evolution from overt suppression to redefinition, it really sets the stage for how secret societies are described in the material. It suggests a move from formal, maybe hierarchical groups to something more informal, embedded in contemporary structures. How has the influence of alleged secret societies changed over time, from, say, the Illuminati to modern hidden in plain sight influence?
Right, the evolution of secret societies, as presented here, it moves from these explicitly banned formal groups to more diffuse, informal, and often less traceable forms of influence. Historically, groups like the Bavarian Illuminati, founded in 1776, banned 1785, they faced direct, overt suppression. Their documents were seized, published by governments trying to expose and neutralize them. Yet this direct suppression didn't actually end the narrative, did it? Instead, popular theories emerged claiming they survived, continued their hidden influence, even blaming them for things like the French Revolution. This shows that the idea of hidden influence persisted, even when the overt organization was dismantled.
So even their suppression just reinforced the belief in their hidden power. How does this compare to modern forms of alleged influence described?
Well, in contemporary society, the concept of secret societies seems to have evolved. While overt hierarchical organizations might decline due to reputational liabilities, public suspicion, the difficulty of maintaining secrecy in our connected world, the material suggests powerful elites might opt for more informal collusion. They might operate through existing networks, think old boy networks, alumni associations, exclusive social clubs, or, perhaps more subtly, they hide their influence in plain sight by legitimizing it through formal structures. Things like think tanks, international forums like Davos, industry events, or even within government agencies where power can be consolidated and exercised through seemingly normal bureaucratic means.
Can you give a modern example of this hiding in plain sight idea from the sources?
Well, an example cited is how a government might use a major social media platform, TikTok is mentioned. But it could be not necessarily through overt censorship, but by subtly influencing algorithms, shadow banning certain topics, promoting specific narratives, amplifying particular voices while diminishing others. This isn't a secret handshake in a dark room scenario. It's described as a sophisticated, embedded form of influence that leverages existing, legitimate structures and digital technologies. This signifies a clear shift from formalized covert groups to a more embedded, diffuse, and less traceable form of influence and control, making it harder to identify and, consequently, maybe harder to resist or expose. The concealment here is less about keeping a secret organization hidden and more about making overt influence appear natural or legitimate or just part of the background noise.
It's interesting how ancient ideas can resurface or get reinterpreted in new cultural contexts. The material also talks about the emergence of New Age responses. How does this movement relate to the re-engagement with ancient mystical ideas in a modern context? And what are its core tenets that might challenge traditional concealment narratives?
Yes, the New Age movement, which arose from earlier esoteric traditions, influences like mid-20th century UFO religions, the 60s counterculture. It represents a significant modern response to and re-engagement with ancient mystical ideas. It's essentially a synthesis, a melting pot of various spiritual and philosophical traditions, old and new. This movement emphasizes a holistic worldview, this idea of universal interconnectedness, that all things are subtly linked, and the inherent divine essence of humanity. It often explicitly rejects the dualism found in many traditional religions, separating spirit and matter, good and evil, and also the reductionism of Cartesian science, which tries to understand things by breaking them down into their smallest parts. Instead, the New Age often seeks a more integrated, all-encompassing understanding of reality.
What are some of its key characteristics that tie back to and maybe reinterpret ancient mysticism, often in ways that seem to challenge established narratives?
Well, a core concept in the New Age is channeling, where individuals claim contact with non-physical entities, spirits, higher intelligences to receive spiritual guidance or information. This is often seen as a contemporary form of receiving spiritual authority. And the movement sometimes even reframes historical religious revelations, like those of prophets or spiritual leaders, as simply earlier forms of channeling. This demonstrates an attempt to reclaim or reinterpret ancient mystical experiences outside the confines of traditional institutional control, arguing that direct access to spiritual knowledge is possible for anyone, not just designated figures. The New Age also embraces the idea of a universal ultimate source, from which all things originate, often seen as a divine, impersonal cosmic energy. It posits that humans are themselves divine in essence, sharing in this universal consciousness. This perspective, influenced by traditions like theosophy and anthroposophy, reflects a modern endeavor, an endeavor to reconnect with spiritual truths that might have been suppressed, marginalized, or rendered inaccessible by established religious and scientific systems, thereby, in its view, breaking through layers of alleged concealment.
Finally, how has the landscape of information control itself evolved in the modern era, particularly with the constant flood of information and increasing public access? It seems harder to conceal things now, doesn't it? Or is it?
That's a crucial point, and it's complex. The modern landscape of information control reflects a highly evolved dynamic. On one hand, yes, we see governments occasionally acknowledging things like unidentifiable crafts or unexplained phenomena, sometimes even publicly discussing the possibility of extraterrestrials. This seemingly transparent disclosure, however, is presented in some material as potentially concealing deeper truths or implications, suggesting a strategy of selective information release. The idea being you disclose some information to control the narrative around it while still withholding the full picture or maybe the most profound implications.
Yeah. So the very act of disclosure can itself be a form of strategic concealment. Interesting. And how do recurring historical narratives like the Smithsonian archaeological conspiracy adapt to this new landscape?
The recurring Smithsonian archaeological conspiracy narratives are a prime example of how historical events and institutional actions are continually reinterpreted through this lens of cover-up theories. These narratives adapt. They latch on to new political climates, new media landscapes, showing a persistent skepticism towards official accounts. What's particularly notable, and we touched on this, is how the very denials issued by institutions meant to clarify or debunk often become interpreted as further proof of concealment by those already predisposed to believe. This creates that powerful feedback loop where attempts at clarification can inadvertently reinforce the belief in an ongoing cover-up. This highlights the sophisticated and adaptable nature of alleged information control in the digital age, where the sheer volume of information can be both a tool for exposure and a dense cover for concealment, making it incredibly challenging for individuals to discern what's genuinely known versus what's speculation or misinformation. V. Practical relevance for understanding the world.
Okay, given this really complex tapestry of alleged concealment, evolving narratives from ancient Heka right through to modern information warfare, what's the practical relevance for you, our listener? How can we use these insights to navigate information but understand the world around us? How can we apply this stuff to our daily lives, our quest to be well-informed?
The practical relevance, as presented, is potentially profound. It urges a fundamental shift, really. A shift in how we engage with information, how we understand societal structures, how we approach our own potential for consciousness. Ultimately, it seems to be about empowering individual discernment and fostering a deeper, maybe more critical engagement with reality.
Let's start with cultivating critical information literacy. That seems key. In a world where certain beliefs are so readily labeled conspiracy theories, how can we develop the ability to distinguish between genuine analysis and just, dismissal? This feels crucial for navigating almost any complex topic today.
It becomes absolutely essential. Yeah. Cultivating a robust critical information literacy. This means learning to recognize the strategies often employed to dismiss claims, like the tactical labeling we discussed, conspiracy theory. While, sure, some claims are baseless or fantastical, the material highlights that this labeling tactic itself can be used strategically to avoid substantive engagement with evidence or alternative viewpoints. Therefore, it's crucial to develop the ability to distinguish. Distinguish between a detailed analysis, one that genuinely engages with facts, points out specific errors, logical fallacies, and mere labeling or dismissiveness without supporting argumentation. This really urges you, as a listener, to consistently question the source, question the intent behind a message, question the specific evidence presented. In any claim, whether it comes from an official source or an unofficial one, it's about strengthening your own mental immune system, as the material puts it, against manipulative narratives, allowing you to scrutinize information independently rather than just accepting it at face value.
Mm-hmm. And this directly relates to recognizing these alleged mechanisms of societal shaping. If education and other institutions might prioritize compliance and process over genuine consciousness and personhood, how does understanding that framework help us examine our own learning experiences, maybe even societal pressures we feel?
Understanding that education systems and other institutions may prioritize compliance and process over genuine consciousness and personhood, well, it offers a critical framework. A framework for examining your own learning experiences and the broader societal pressures you encounter. The concept of field-settled consciousness, for example, positing consciousness as a universal driver rather than just a passenger, it encourages a deeper inquiry into human potential beyond just conventional materialist models. This perspective invites you to explore non-linear thinking, maybe embrace paradox, question what's termed the prison of certainty. That tendency to privilege only what's easily measurable or fits into fixed conventional frameworks. By recognizing how these systems might subtly suppress divergent thinking or disconnect individuals from their core identity, you can consciously seek ways to foster curiosity, symbolic freedom, moral agency in your own life, rather than merely conforming to external expectations. It's about consciously choosing to nurture your true self, perhaps, even against certain societal currents.
And thinking about navigating political and economic influence, what practical insights can we gain? From the discussions on modern forms of control, like the concerns around FEMA, HR 4079, and historical blueprints like the protocols, how can these help us make sense of the world around us?
Well, The discussions surrounding modern forms of control, whether it's government legislative power, media influence, or the detailed economic manipulation outlined in texts like the Protocols, they highlight how power can be exercised subtly, or even, as mentioned, in plain sight, through seemingly legitimate structures. Being aware of how political agendas can amplify or even integrate elements of conspiracy narratives, like with the Smithsonian controversy, provides a crucial lens, a lens through which to analyze contemporary events and cultural conflicts. This awareness helps you try to discern when narratives, even those seemingly about historical cover-ups, might be weaponized to deepen societal divisions or maybe serve specific political and economic outcomes. It underscores the importance of scrutinizing not just the content of information, but also the context in which it's presented. Who is presenting it? What underlying interests might it serve? It essentially empowers you to be a more informed and discerning citizen, hopefully.
Finally, how does engaging with diverse belief systems, including these ancient mystical traditions and their alleged suppression, how does that equip us to navigate a complex world and broaden our own understanding?
Engaging with diverse belief systems, particularly exploring ancient mystical traditions, their historical integration, their subsequent reinterpretation or suppression. It helps you appreciate the vast spectrum of human, spiritual, and philosophical inquiry that has existed across millennia. It's truly vast. This historical context encourages a more nuanced understanding how cultural and historical contexts shape what gets labeled knowledge versus what's dismissed as superstition or delusion. It allows you to approach diverse worldviews with discernment, recognizing that what's considered truth can be fluid and significantly subject to institutional influence and the prevailing intellectual climate of the time. Ultimately, this whole deep dive, I think, encourages you to continuously question, explore, synthesize information independently. It highlights that the pursuit of knowledge isn't about passively accepting fixed frameworks, but about engaging in an ongoing, maybe recursive, dialogue with reality. And that idea that humanity might be hosted by consciousness rather than its soul builder, it offers a provocative thought, doesn't it? About our true place in the universe and the potential for greater awareness. If we perhaps liberate ourselves from imposed constraints and engage with reality beyond just its immediately observable material aspects, it invites you to consider that the deepest truths might sometimes be found not just in what's overtly presented, but perhaps in what might have been deliberately obscured.
This deep dive really reveals how deeply intertwined the concepts of power, knowledge, and belief truly are, and how the narrative of concealment, whether it's historical fact or contemporary theory, continues to shape our perception of reality. It's definitely a powerful reminder that understanding the systems that govern us often begins with a critical look at the information we receive, and maybe a willingness to explore what might lie beneath the surface.
Indeed. The material before us, in all its varied forms, really invites us to consider that what is known and what is believed aren't always in perfect alignment, and that the boundaries of what is considered fact can be influenced by, well, many factors, often unseen. The journey to being truly well-informed often requires looking beyond the obvious and questioning what might be deliberately obscured, and importantly, asking why.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.